there, everybody, and welcome back to the Sagas of Swamp Thing. Today, we are reading issue number 23, and just a little catch-up on what happened on the last issue. Last time, Swamp Thing was captured by some government scientists who thought he was some kind of mutation of a virus that they were trying to contain, and they brought him to a secret facility in the middle of the desert that was inside of a mountain, and we found out that there was a doctor named Dr. Solomon who actually created this virus on accident, and it infected not only the town nearby, but his family as well. And so he was trying to find a cure, but as part of that, the people who were infected could not go outside because they would infect the rest of the population. So they were basically being held prisoner. Oh, and one important side effect about this virus is that eventually it will drive you mad. And unfortunately, the doctor's own son ends up going kind of mad, and he starts a rebellion to break out of this facility, and unfortunately his own father had to stop him from doing that by shooting and killing him. And after that, Dr. Solomon was in such despair and had given up hope now that his lab was pretty much destroyed to develop a cure for this disease. He decided the best thing and the only thing to do is to self-destruct the whole facility. But he does let Swamp Thing out right before he does that. So Swamp Thing gets out into the desert, and then the mountain behind him collapses in on itself. And all this talk about a cure and whatnot got Swamp Thing thinking that there might be another way for him to cure his Swamp Thingness. So he walks from the desert of Arizona and New Mexico all the way up to the northwest, I believe in Oregon, where we saw him walking up a driveway towards a house, and as he passes the end of that driveway, we see a mailbox that has the name Holland on it. And that was where we left off. So first things first with issue 23, we got the cover. We see a man in blue spandex that has a saber attached to his right arm, and he looks like he's trying to kill Swamp Thing, who looks like he is morphing back into Alec Holland on the cover of this issue. And there was a woman who is trying to stop the man in blue from hitting Swamp Thing with the sword, and she's saying, "No, Sabre, don't kill him! Can't you see? Swamp Thing is becoming human!" And I should also mention that this cover looks a little bit different because I think they were trying to redesign the logo to make it sell better. So the title changed to these big 3D letters that look like they're popping out from the page. It's not better than the original in my opinion, but they were trying something new. And as we turn to the first page, we see the man in blue spandex that has some red accents is standing in the middle of the lab, and he's swinging a saber that is attached to his right hand at an image of Swamp Thing that is being generated by one of these machines. The display almost looks like a baseball card or something with Swamp Thing on it, but it's made of glass and it's life-size. And we get some narration that says, "Far beneath the streets of a quiet Midwestern American city, a savage voice cries out in anger, and a shattering crash punctuates the cry, filling a streamlined chamber with sound and fury." And as the man, who I believe is named Sabre, swings his sword, he hits this glass display, and he yells, "I tell you, the Swamp Thing must die!" And as the panel of glass shatters with Swamp Thing's image in it, he yells "die" 3 more times. And we also see on this page that this issue is called Rebirth and Nightmare, and it is written by Jerry Conway with art by Nestor Redondo. Then from behind Sabre, we see a bunch of TV monitors, and one of them lights up and says, "Please, Sabre, control yourself. You're working for the Colossus organization now, not the U.S. government. There are matters at stake here which go far beyond your petty personal vendettas." And I should say the man on the screen is completely covered with a red mask and suit, so we can't see the man's face. And Sabre turns around and says, "Not so, Councilman Red. As your chief enforcer, I tell you, the Swamp Thing is a danger to us and must be destroyed." And Councilman Red says, "Nonsense. If the creature dies, so does his alter ego, Dr. Alec Holland. And if Holland dies, his biorestorative formula dies also. The Swamp Thing must be captured, Sabre. Alive." And then Sabre swings his sword into that glass again, and he yells, "No! Because of him, I lost my career, my honor, and my hand. If you think I've joined Colossus just to see my worst enemy coddled, then..." Councilman Red cuts him off, yelling, "Silence! We commissioned you to catch Alec Holland, Sabre. But if you refuse, we can always turn to our newest agents, the Elementals." And as Councilman Red says this, we see a giant metal door open up, and a very large and muscular humanoid man walks through. He is wearing a purple leotard with blue accents, and Councilman Red continues speaking, saying, "Such as Thrudvang, the Earthmaster." And as Sabre sees Thrudvang, he says kind of under his breath in fear, "Dear God." And Councilman Red continues speaking, saying, "Once Thrudvang was a man, before our scientists found him on Skid Row and spent months recreating him. Now, as you can see, he's something more than a man." Then Thrudvang walks over to a metal chair in the room, and he picks it up and he crumples it into a ball in his hands. And Councilman Red continues saying, "He's power incarnate. He can either assist you, Sabre, or replace you. The choice is yours." And Sabre replies, "All right, Councilman, you win. I'll track down your precious Dr. Holland, and I'll bring him back alive. But, pal, don't hold your breath." Then we cut to Swamp Thing, who is in the same spot where we left off in the last issue. He is walking up the driveway that has the mailbox that says Holland, and as he approaches the house, he thinks, "What was it Thomas Wolfe said? You can't go home again? I've always accepted that as gospel. It's kept me away from here these past months, even when I've known in my soul that only my brother Edward can help me now. If anyone can." So Swamp Thing gets to the front door, and he doesn't knock or anything. He just turns the handle and opens the door, and inside the room we see a young white woman who's wearing bell-bottoms and a bikini top, and she has red hair, and she turns around because she hears the door open, and she says, "Professor Holland? Is that you?" But she sees Swamp Thing, and she screams out, and Swamp Thing, of course, just thought he was going to see his brother, even though I'm pretty sure his brother doesn't know he's Swamp Thing, so he might have screamed out as well. But he's got a look of concern on his face for the woman because she falls back as she tries to move away from him, and Swamp Thing thinks, "No!" And as she falls backwards, I guess she begins to faint just because she's seen Swamp Thing. And as Swamp Thing moves to catch her, we get some narration about this woman that says, "Ruth Monroe isn't the sort of woman given to demure fainting spells, and she's always had contempt for those women who were. Since reaching maturity, she's been proud of her independence, her self-control, her lack of cliched femininity. Yet, at this instant, her prized self-possession is swept aside, and she does what she has always sworn she'd never do. She faints dead away. And just before she hits the ground, Swamp Thing catches her, and as he picks her up in his arms, he thinks, "Blast! I should have realized something like this would happen. Because I'm alone so much, I keep forgetting how horrible I look. It's the sort of thing a man willingly remembers. Still, I didn't expect Edward to have a woman around the house." And then he looks down at her and kind of examines her features, and he thinks, "And not such an attractive woman at that. Odd. She reminds me of Linda somehow. Her skin's soft. Her hair's the same straw color." But then Swamp Thing sets her on a couch that happens to have a mirror next to it, and he catches a glimpse of himself, and this angers him, so he picks up a little statue on a desk nearby, and he throws it at the mirror, shattering it. And just as he does that, we see another door open, and a man comes in saying, "Good Lord, what on earth?" Then Swamp Thing turns to see the man, and he thinks, "Edward." And of course, this looks real bad for Swamp Thing because, he's a monster and he's standing above a woman. And of course, Edward doesn't know that Alec is Swamp Thing, so he rushes in and says, "Ruth, what have you done to her? So help me, if she's..." But Swamp Thing cuts him off, yelling, "Wait." But Edward doesn't wait. He just rushes to Swamp Thing and he punches him in the chest. And out of instinct, Swamp Thing just grabs Edward by the wrist and pulls him into the air so that he's dangling. And he thinks, "Edward." And then he says out loud, "Listen, I'm your brother." And this gives Edward pause, and he says, "Alec? Dear God." Then we cut to a little while later on the balcony of this house. And I gotta say, this balcony in this house has some great views of the mountains and wooded areas surrounding it. But we do see that it looks like things have calmed down because Ruth and Edward are sitting in some Adirondack chairs, and Swamp Thing is standing next to them. And the narration says, "The words when they come are hard. The Swamp Thing's vocal cords are not accustomed to human sound, and talking is painful. Still, an explanation must be made, and is. And when the grating voice breaks off, neither Edward Holland nor Ruth Monroe can speak, until then we see Edward break the silence and say, "I've always wondered. You and Linda were too good to die in the simple, stupid explosion, to end your careers because of an inane chemical accident." Then Edward kind of just repeats everything Swamp Thing told him so that the audience of new readers will get the origin of Swamp Thing via exposition. So we do get like a whole full recap of Swamp Thing's origin, so I won't read all that because we already know all of it. And when Edward's finished recounting, he lights a pipe and he begins to smoke it as he says, "These past months must have been a nightmare for you, Alec. A constant torment. Hunted by the Conclave, even by your own government. Well, at least that's ended. And now? What happens now, Alec?" And Swamp Thing says, "Edward, help me." And Edward looks at him and says, "All right, brother, I'll help you." And Ruth chimes in, "Oh, Edward, do you think it's possible?" And Edward puts a hand on her shoulder and he says, "If he can be helped, I can help him, Ruth. I'm twice the chemist Alec is or ever was. Trust me, Ruth. Trust me." Then we turn the page and we get a whole montage page of experiments being done by Edward on Swamp Thing. We see him hooked to a bunch of machines, and we see Edward analyzing data, and Ruth is helping him. And over these panels, we get some narration that says, "So it begins. A desperate search for the answer to one man's personal nightmare. Hours pass like minutes, and for 3 characters in this private drama, time becomes elastic, stretching and stretching, losing its reality as evening becomes night, night becomes morning, morning becomes day, and day flows again into evening. 24 hours go by, and still the tests continue. Then at last, 2 hours into the second day, the work is finished, and for the first time in many hours, Edward Holland smiles." So we see Edward looking at some results from a test, and he says, "It can be done. A slim chance, but it's there. The chance is there." And then Ruth happily says, "Tell him, Edward. Tell him." And Edward turns to Swamp Thing and says, "Alec, you're going to be human again. You're going to be a man." Then we turn the page, and we cut to later that night where we see Swamp Thing is exiting the house, and I guess he's just wanting to kind of stare at the moon. And over this panel, the narration says, "Slowly, wearily, the Swamp Thing nods, and then his heavy body turns and leaves the basement laboratory. His shoulders seem bent by some great weight, and his eyes are bleak and cold. Not at all the eyes of a man who sees salvation." And we see Swamp Thing staring longingly at the moon. And we also see behind Swamp Thing, Ruth is walking up, so she must have seen him go outside, and she says, "Mind if I join you, Dr. Holland?" And Swamp Thing doesn't say anything, so she says, "You know, my mother's the reason I'm Professor Holland's assistant. A great lady, my mother. One of the first libbers in her own way. My mother, she wanted me to stand on my own, to be a complete person, a total woman." Then Swamp Thing turns to look at her, and she continues saying, "We were poor too, you see, and so she had to work hard to send both my brother and me through college. Other parents, they might have just sent my brother, but not Mom. She wanted to give us both a chance to be the best we could be, and she gave us that chance. A year ago, I graduated magna cum laude in biochemistry, and I'm working on my master's degree here with your brother. And my mother? My mother died a month before my graduation." And then Ruth reaches out and puts a hand on Swamp Thing's shoulder, and she continues saying, "So you see, Dr. Holland, I know how you feel. Here you are, finally able to be human again, and the one person in the world you want to share it with is gone. For you, your wife." And then she turns and leaves Swamp Thing standing there, and as she walks away, she says, "Guess we've got a lot in common." And then she goes into the house, and Swamp Thing turns and watches her go inside. Then we get a zoomed out panel where we can see the house of Edward Holland and the mountain that it's kind of resting against. And then high in the air above, there is some sort of flying craft, and the narration says, "The Oregon air is crisp and cold at this altitude. A fine, clear air, as unlike a city smog, as glass is unlike a blackboard. The man called Sabre enjoys the night air, drawing it deep into his lungs, releasing it again with a sigh. He hardly hears the rasped breath beside him, and what he hears, he studiously ignores. For the past 12 hours, Sabre and his silent companion have ridden westward in their Colossus-supplied hovercraft, following the beep of a small transmitter attached to the shoulder of the slime-coated swamp thing. How it got there is a long story, and at the moment, doesn't really matter. Suffice to say, the agents of Colossus are ubiquitous. They're everywhere." I love that Jerry Conway just was like, I need a transmitter in this moment so that we can explain how they followed Swamp Thing, but I don't want to do any of the work to explain how it got on him, so just believe someone somewhere put it on Swamp Thing. So we see this hovercraft land on the edge of the mountain that overlooks Edward Holland's house. We see Sabre get out, and Thrudvang is just chilling in the hovercraft. And as Sabre looks down on the Holland house, he thinks, "I could take you now, swamp beast, but I won't. With your brother involved, the stakes have become somewhat higher. Let's just wait a few days. I've got all the time in the world." Then we cut to Ruth Monroe, and she is somewhere in a nearby town loading some things onto a truck, and the narration in this panel says, "The college town of Quinn, Oregon, a pleasant hamlet nestled in a valley away from the world. Perhaps not the most studious academic community in the country, but certainly one of the most relaxed." And we see there is a young man helping Ruth load some of the boxes into the truck, and he says to her, "A lot of stuff you got here, Miss Monroe." And Ruth says, "That's not the end of it, Ned. Professor Holland needs some more chemicals, on order from a pharmaceutical company back east. And there's the matter of this dynamite." And Ned's kind of freaked out by that, and he asks, "Dynamite?" And then Ruth nonchalantly says, "Ned, you've got to get us 5 sticks of dynamite from your father's farm. It's a lot to ask, I know, but it's dreadfully important." And Ned replies, "He'll kill me if he finds out, Miss Monroe." And Ruth says, "Who will tell him? You?" I'm not sure if they're trying to imply that she's kind of saying this seductively or something, because he is like a college-age young man, and she's literally asking him to steal explosives. And like any college boy who is asked by a hot woman to do something, he says, "Okay, Miss Monroe, I'll get your dynamite. Somehow." And then Ruth gets in the truck, and as she drives away, she waves to him and says, "Thanks, Ned. And I do mean thanks." And as she drives away, Ned kind of rubs the back of his head and thinks, "Dynamite?" Then we turn the page and we cut back to Edward Holland's house. And it must be a couple days later because we see Ruth outside of a barn on their property, and she is setting up a very large inflatable pool and filling it with water. And then from inside the barn, we hear Edward say, "Our problem was to recreate the sequence of events which led to your first transformation, Alec. And in the past 3 days, I think we've accomplished this. We're ready to begin if you are." Then we get to inside the barn and we see there's somewhat of a lab set up inside of it, and Swamp Thing is standing next to Edward and his laboratory equipment. And Edward continues saying, "Everything is as it was that day. The chemicals, their arrangement on the lab table, the bomb, and outside, we've even built a swamp. A colleague in Louisiana sent me an analysis of the swamp waters there, and I think we've..." But Swamp Thing cuts him off saying, "Edward." And Edward Holland says, "I'm sorry, Alec. Of course. You're impatient. Very well, then. The bomb is set to go off in 1 minute. You'll know what to do then." And then Edward Holland walks out of the barn, and we see Swamp Thing just waiting for the explosion. And in this panel where he's waiting, the narration says, 1 minute. The seconds literally crawl. And as each instant goes past, it brings another memory. Until 60 memories later, all time ends in one blinding white-hot explosion. And we get a giant explosion panel, which looks very reminiscent of the first explosion that turned him into Swamp Thing. Then we get some narration that says, "Agony. Red, raging pain flows over the muck-encrusted Swamp Thing, stunning him with its torment. Once before, he staggered from a burning room, feeling such pain. Then we see Swamp Thing running from the flames of the barn out to the inflatable pool, and as Ruth and Edward see him running, she says, "Oh my God! Oh my dear God!" And as Swamp Thing jumps into the water, the narration continues saying, "Once before, he stumbled blindly, searching for cool waters, finding only the mud of the swamp. For Alec Holland, it seems as though the world has spun round in a circle, like the legendary worm Ouroboros, a creature which endlessly devoured its own tail, consuming itself over and over, beginning to end. In pain, he splashes in the slime, as he splashed once before. And, as he did that time long ago, he feels a change occurring within him." So according to the narration, a transformation is taking place, and this experiment is in the middle of working. But unfortunately, Sabre decides right now to show up, and he jumps into the action and slices the inflatable pool with his sword arm, and he yells, "No! You've gone far enough! It's over, you understand? Over!" And Swamp Thing looks up as the pool deflates and the water begins to rush out of it, and he thinks, "What in the name of heaven?" But it seems like he's too weak to stand up or do anything, and as Sabre stands above him with his sword raised high, he says, "It's a trick! A filthy trick to escape me now, as you escaped me before. But this time I've got you, monster. This time you'll die." And as Sabre is talking, the narration says, "Through a swirl of pain, the Swamp Thing hears Sabre's voice, and hearing it, remembers, and remembering, knows. He's met this man before." And as Swamp Thing recalls this man's voice, we see Sabre remove his mask, and he looks down at Swamp Thing and says, "Look at me, monster! Look at the face of the man you've destroyed! I'm John Zero, a cipher, a bureaucrat, a nobody until you came along, and you ruined everything!" And we get an editor's note that this all happened in Swamp Thing 13, which I had to look up because I forgot what happened, but apparently he is one of the men who was knocked out when Matt Cable and Abby and Bolt were breaking Swamp Thing out of the government facility. So Swamp Thing, who's still on fire, begins to kind of sit up, and Sabre sees Edward Holland and Ruth, and he takes a swing at Edward with his sword hand, as Edward is saying, "Get away before I..." And we see Sabre's sword chop Edward's smoking pipe in half. And then Sabre turns to Swamp Thing and says, "Capturing you was my greatest accomplishment, monster. The finest moment of my career. Then you were lost in an explosion, presumed dead. And all my dreams, my hopes, everything I worked for died with you. At first, nothing changed, but slowly, I began to receive fewer assignments, less responsibilities, more paperwork. My bosses were easing me out." And as he says that last line, he takes a swipe at Swamp Thing's chest, and it seems like it does hit slightly as Swamp Thing tries to dodge. And as Sabre raises his sword arm to take another swing, he says, "Replacing me with a younger man? And why? Because of you!" And with that, he swings down with his sword and barely misses Swamp Thing as his sword slams into a tree trunk that is next to them on the ground. And as Swamp Thing dodges, he thinks, "He's insane, and I'm so weak from this chemical bath I just had. He can slice me apart. Have to grab him while I can still stand up." So Swamp Thing lunges at Sabre, but Sabre is able to dodge, and he says to Swamp Thing, "Clumsy, monster. Very clumsy. You're probably wondering about my little sword hand, aren't you? It's something else I owe you for." And as Sabre pulls back his sword arm to strike again, all of a sudden we see Ruth jump up and grab a hold of his arm, and she says, "You've got to stop this. I won't let you hurt him anymore." And as Sabre looks at her with surprise, we do see Swamp Thing on the ground in front of him, and one of his arms is looking kind of human, like he's beginning to transform, and he thinks, "Dear God, my arm!" Then we see Sabre hit Ruth across the face with his elbow, and he yells out, "Witch! No one touches Sabre! No one!" And Ruth falls down to the ground unconscious. And Swamp Thing sees this, and he thinks, Ruth! And then he begins to have a flashback because Ruth, unconscious on the ground, looks a lot like his Linda. And over this panel, the narration says, the sharp crack of bone hitting bone reaches through the Swamp Thing's agony, touching deep within his soul, to the memory of another woman struck down by idle cruelty. Linda Holland, once this monster's wife. Memory combines with reality, and the product is rage. Then the slowly transforming Swamp Thing jumps up and punches Sabre in the chest and yells, "No!" And with that, Sabre falls back into the flames of the barn, and Swamp Thing falls forward into them as well. And the narration says, without purpose or plan, the Swamp Thing collides with the man called Sabre, striking with a force almost as inexorable as destiny. The two figures stumble and fall, and in the instant, are lost from view with a sudden gout of flame. There follows a cry, like the wail of a soul damned to hell. And then, nothing. Only silence. Then we see Ruth regain consciousness, and she runs over to Edward, who is also unconscious on the ground, I guess from when Sabre hit the pipe out of his mouth, maybe he fell over. And as she runs to him, she yells, Professor Holland? And as Edward begins to sit up, he says, well, what is it? What happened to Alec? And as Ruth gives him a hand, she says, they're in the barn. My God, we've got to wait. Then we cut to a horrific panel that I guess she is seeing, and we see in the flames, Sabre is literally melting, like his face and the suit he's wearing and the sword that is attached to his arm are all melting in the heat of the flames, and he's yelling, Lord, Lord! But we also see a human Alec rising from the flames, and the narration says, like ghosts from hell, two wraiths appear out of the smoke, stumbling blindly. One in physical torment, his body burned beyond recognition. The other, unburned, untouched, and yet not unchanged. Then we see Alex step out onto the grass away from the barn, and Ruth and Edward run over to him, and she says, wow, oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. And Edward exclaims as she gives him a hug, it worked. After all these months, all this agony, Alec Holland lives again. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.